Well, welcome to week 4 of When Your Back's Against the Wall. Hope you guys have had an incredible day so far. This whole series is based upon content that we're using from Manna Church. And this whole series, we've been living in Psalms 143. So I'd love to invite all of you guys to go ahead and turn your Bibles to page 477. We're going to be looking at that Psalms all morning. If you're at home, tune in and grab your Bible as well. I love this Psalms 143 because it is raw and it is real. And it speaks to those of us who feel like we've been pushed against the wall. Our backs are pushed back against the wall. We're in a corner. And so if you walked in here today and your back is against the wall and you're needing to know how to move forward, today is for you. And I want you to know, as we get started, God sees you. He sees you exactly where you are with your back against the wall, wanting to know how to move forward, and he shows us how to move forward. But before we move forward, he invites us to look inward, to settle our hearts before we start to move our feet. And see, this psalm that we've been looking at for the last couple of weeks is divided into 2 parts. It's divided into this process part that is all about how do we settle our hearts. And then it gives us these 7 prayers of how do we move our feet. And today we're gonna continue talking about how do we apply this process. And then we're gonna talk about how does God answer that prayer of what do we do next. So let's go ahead and go ahead and get started and review what this process has looked like. How do we get our hearts right? And then we'll dig in to figure out how we figure out where God is leading. So hopefully by now you've found Psalms 143 on page 477. So a little context on this. We don't fully know what's pushed David's back against the wall, but what we do know is how he's feeling at this moment. So as we read these opening verses, listen to how David talks about his emotions, how he talks about what he's feeling as he's being pushed against the wall. So page 477, starting in verse 1 of Psalms 143, David says, "Hear my prayer, O Lord. Listen to my plea. Answer me because you are faithful and righteous. Don't put your servant on trial, for no one is innocent before you. My enemy has chased me. He has knocked me to the ground. He forces me to live in darkness like those in the grave." Listen to the weight of this next sentence. He says, "I am losing all hope. I am paralyzed with fear." Man, can you feel the pain that David's expressing right there? Can you feel that struggle? Can you feel the heaviness of his heart as he's pushed against the wall? Can you feel those words, "I am losing all hope"? Do you know what it's like to be paralyzed with fear, to feel overwhelmed and uncertain of where and how to turn? Have you ever had one of those moments? Or maybe you entered in today in one of those moments? Man, before we even start reviewing the process that David lays out of how we resettle our hearts and figure out how God is leading, man, I just want you guys to know out of the gate, it is okay to not be okay. This is actually one of the things that I love most about Jesus and I love about LCBC is that it's okay to not be okay. It's okay to not be okay. It is okay to show up today or to tune in online and just simply be saying, I'm not okay. It's okay if you're walking in today limping and busted and broken and exhausted, either because of someone else's choices or your own. Man, we just want you to know it is okay to not be okay. So what I want to invite you to do is just to stop shaming yourself that you're not perfect, that you don't have it all figured out, that you're hurting. And I want to invite you to start helping yourself by doing what David invites us to do in this Psalms. See, I love that David doesn't share what pushed him against the wall. We don't know if it was his mistake or someone else's mistake, but all we know is what happens when we stay against the wall. See, the reason why this matters so much to us as a church that we get this right is because we've all seen what happens if you stay pushed against the wall and we don't learn how to pivot to address our heart, because we've all seen a caged animal go nuts and flip out. We've all seen ourselves and others when we're pushed against the wall react and push back and respond in ways that we hate. And if I'm really honest, the reason why this series has been mattering so much to me is because I know that the worst things I've ever said, the worst things that I've ever done have happened when I felt my back being pushed against the wall. And most of us have heard that when people feel pushed against the wall, that whole phrase, they fight or freeze. Well, this last week I was talking with a friend and she said that she just heard a sociologist added a new one that we also fawn, saying that when our backs are pushed against the wall, we either fight back We flee and run away. We freeze and make no choice. Or now people are starting to grovel and fawn and beg and dote, trying to woo the person in front of them to do what they want. See, the gift that David is giving us in this Psalms is he's not only making it safe to say it's okay to not be okay, but he's saying there's another way forward. There's another way forward as we practice these 4 steps that he lays out for us, that reorients our heart, that keeps us from finding ourselves fighting or fleeing or freezing or fawning, but that allows us to find ourselves being faithful to the way that God calls us to live, faithful to the way that God says is best. So there's a reason over the last couple of weeks we've been repeating this process each weekend. It's because we all know the pain of our freakouts. We all know the fallouts of our freakouts whenever we start freezing others out and running away and fawning and wooing ourselves back into a mess. And as a church, we're just hoping that we stop knowing the fallouts of our freakouts, but that we start to discover the fallouts of what faithfulness brings, of what happens when we're pushed against the wall and we reorient ourselves back to God, and we find our footing and our foundation from him, and then move forward. So David, he models for us these 4 steps. And I just want you guys to know that if we practice these 4 steps, this process of addressing our heart before we move our feet, it really can save and change our lives. See, here's what David says. David says, I remember the days of old. We're in verse 5. I ponder all your great works. I think about what you've done. I lift my hands to you in prayer. I thirst for you as parched land thirsts for rain. Man, this process is where breakthroughs happen, where we move from our freakouts to faithful. And this process is what shifts David's focus from what has his back against the wall to who God is. See, David invites us to remember and to ponder and to meditate and worship. And David says that as I remember, and as I ponder, and as I meditate, and as I worship, something happens in me. And so David starts by just saying, man, remember the days of old. He models for us the first thing that we need to do when we feel pushed against the wall to start this process is to simply remember. In other words, I'm going to go backwards in order to be able to go forwards. I'm going to recall what God has done in the past and how God has broken through for others in the past. I'm going to stop and intentionally look back in the past to see where God's been great. I'm going to look back at the lives of others where God's power has been put on display. I'm going to remember by looking back in order to see how faithful God has been. And as we look back, and as we're reminded of that God is powerful and that God is faithful, it's from that place that David says that he says, I remember and then I ponder. I ponder all of your great works. I ponder, in other words, I'm going to think about all the ways that you've been great and all the things that you've done and all the ways that you've shown up. It's like David is saying, Lord, I see the stars and the vastness of the oceans that you've created. And I see the grandeur of the mountains and I feel the fierceness of your thunder and lightning. And it's from that place that I ponder your greatness as I remember you. See what happens as we do this, as we remember and as we ponder, what happens is our God gets bigger and our problems start to get smaller. When we feel ourselves pushed against the wall and all we see is how big our problems are, when we stop and remember and start to ponder, all of a sudden we're reminded just how big our God is. And because how big he is, how small our problems are. So we remember, and then we ponder. And then David leads us in verse 5 to meditate or to think about what he's done. We meditate on the million ways that God has already shown up in our lives, provided for our lives, all the things that could have gone this way but didn't, all the ways that God shows up. And it gets personal, remembering the ways that God has uniquely showed up in your life and met your needs and stepped into your world. Over the last couple of months, I've shared with some of you guys that 2020 and 2021 was a really, really hard year for my family. And I shared with many of you that I felt like God pushed us, or life pushed us into a corner, and we found ourselves with our backs against the wall. If you know my story, you know that in about 18 months, 4 of my 6 childhood pillars passed away. We just had a ton of death in our family. And that left us with a widowed mother to care for, with houses to clean up, with estates to close out, with unbelievable frustration with wills and titles and insurances, and just this ton of legal nonsense that we had to figure out how to navigate. And guys, it was just a mess. It was such a stressful, emotional mess. And there were moments that the grief and the magnitude, it just pushed our entire family into a corner, and each of us were wanting to freak out on each other and to fight or to flee or to fawn or just to kind of like freeze and do nothing. Like, we felt all of that. And what was amazing is in the midst of all of that pain and discomfort and emotion and fear, when we paused and did what David talked about, and we practiced this process that we've been talking about over the last couple of weeks, when we did that and remembered who God was and what was actually promised, and we pondered his presence and his provision, and then meditated on his unbelievable peace and comfort and care, we found ourselves in the midst of our pain naturally doing what David says comes next. What David says comes next in the Psalms is we find ourselves worshiping. And for my family, we just found ourselves worshiping God. And he sent Brandon to load up a moving truck. And he sent Sherry with biscuits when we needed them the most. And he sent Gail to help us figure out how the courts work. And he sent Cindy to take care of the house and to buy it. And that doors opened just in incredible ways for my mom and my sister's family to move north, and for apartments and for school districts to just to fall into their lap to be able to provide for them. And for a daughter-in-law to say that she wants her mother-in-law to move into her house. Like, just incredible ways God moved in the midst of having our backs pushed against the wall. And we found ourselves in the midst of all of that because we remembered and we pondered and we meditated, being able to worship God in the middle of it all. Man, in the middle of so many things that could have been devastating and destroying, in the midst of all the pain and problems and grief and stress, man, there became all these million little moments of worship and of joy sneaking in, and of us being able to say, oh my goodness, like, look at what God just did in the middle of all of that. We could have left 2022 or 2021 mad at God, but because of this, we left 2021 worshiping God. And so King David, he says, when you're pushed against the wall, man, remember and ponder and meditate and find yourself worshiping. David said it this way. He said, I lift my hands to you in prayer. I thirst for you as parched land thirsts for rain. Man, worship. Worship is what happens when we stand back and we see God in all of his power and his glory and his awesomeness, and we realize that God, he was really that big. And God, you are that powerful. And God, you are in this with us. We're not alone against the wall. God's next to us against that wall. And what's amazing is when we arrive at that place of seeing the greatness and majesty of God, our only response is to lift up our hands and worship and say, God, you are awesome, and I surrender myself to you. This process that David models for us is transformational because these 4 steps of remembering who God is and what he's done and pondering his greatness and meditating on how he's worked in our lives and worshiping him for who he is, this process, man, it gets our hearts and spirits in line with God. And it allows us to gain perspective and to shift our orientation. And that fundamental shift that happens, and that allows us to move from saying, God, get me out of this, to God, thank you for being with me in this. So this matters to us here at LCBC. It matters deeply to us because we desperately hope for each and every one of us that we stop knowing the fallouts of our freakouts and we start to discover God's grace in this place. In this moment, as your back is against the wall, that you find a peace that passes all understanding because you've done the work to remember and ponder and meditate and to discover how you can worship God even in the middle of your own pain and chaos and stress, that God is still faithful with you right there. Man, it's easy to think this process. It's easy to think this process of remembering and pondering and meditating and worship, that it's only for the big moments in life. It's only for the 2020s of life, you know? That it's not for the small moments. But this week, actually, I was prepping for this, and I was trying to get ready, and my phone rang. And have you ever had that moment that when your phone rang, you should have not answered it, but you did? Well, I answered it, and this phone call just went wrong. It went wrong in every way possible. The conversation triggered me. Next thing I know, I'm saying things that triggered that person. Next thing we know, it is just going off the rails. I'm not saying nice things. They're not saying nice things. I'm not being very pastoral. It's not pretty, guys. It was so bad that at the end of the conversation, I'm just like, I think this is done. And it was bad. It was bad. And I hang up the phone and I'm just mad and I am hurt and I'm like, part of me is wanting to keep fighting and another part of me just wants to like run away and another part of me just wants to do like nothing and another part of me, like, I don't know, do we have anybody who's like a natural fawner in here? Like whenever someone's wrong, like something's happened, you're just like, let me go dote and like grovel for your forgiveness and friendship. Like that's like my dark side. And so part of me was like, I need to go grovel and say I'm a terrible human being and I shouldn't have done that. And so like part of me is like, I felt all of that. And it was over a silly phone call. So I hang up the phone and I'm sitting at a coffee shop and I decided, you know what? I'm just gonna work on my message. So I start working on this. And guys, I don't know if you know this, but it is really hard to write a message when you're angry. And I realized that if I was gonna preach what we're talking about today, I had to practice what we're talking about today. And I did like a cosmic eye roll to God of like, do I really have to do this, God? Kind of like my 7-year-old gives me whenever I tell him he has to go clean his room. And so finally I was like, okay, God, I'll remember who you are. And I'll remember that your love for me is not based upon me getting it right. And I remember that your love of me is not based upon never making a mistake. And then I'll ponder all the ways, God, that you have just lavished love and value and acceptance and grace. And that this world, not only on this world, but on me. And then I'm gonna meditate. I'm gonna meditate that God, you love me. Even when I get it wrong. You love me even when I make mistakes, even when I don't do the things that I know I should. God, I know you still love me and that my value and my worth is not dependent upon that. And I found myself just after those 3 steps, calming down. And I found myself being thankful that yet again, grace and mercy was a part of my life. I found myself saying, thank you. That this is the reality that God's inviting us into, not a reality based upon my merit and not messing it up, but upon his merit and his grace. And that day, sitting at a coffee shop, I found myself sipping coffee and worshiping God. Because I'd taken time to remember and ponder and meditate, I found myself going from being angry and hurt to worshiping. And honestly, I was a little bit surprised that these steps worked over something as small as a phone call gone wrong. But what really shocked me was as that process happened, it was only like 3-4 minutes, but I went from being super angry to God breaking my heart for the person on the other end of that phone call. And I found myself realizing I needed to hear their side of the story and I needed to put myself in their shoes. And then I was ready for my heart to hurt with them and for them. And I was ready to say sorry for my part of the story. See, this process that we've been talking about over the last couple of weeks, it's not just for the big, big, big moments of life, but it's also for the daily small moments when we find ourselves needing to check ourselves when that fighter's kicking in or the fleer's kicking in or the one who wants to freeze inside of us is kicking in. It's for all of those little moments to be able to say, okay, God, what does it look like right now to remember and to ponder and to meditate and to worship? And then from this place, respond. So David, he gives us a gift. He gives us a gift in this psalm by laying out these 4 steps that help reorient our lives and our hearts back to the truth and foundation of who Jesus is. And then it's from that place. Now David, he prays 7 prayers. And in this series, we've been looking at those different prayers, and these are prayers that I'm sure all of us have prayed in some way. And some of us have probably prayed it from the same heart that David did, but I'm sure some of us haven't. And what I'm realizing is when our heart is at that place of reliance and worship, these prayers start to change. And it starts to change how we talk about them. And so over the last couple of weeks, we've talked about the first 3 of these prayers that David prayed. Prayers of desperation, prayers of asking for God's presence, prayers to be able to hear God's voice. And today we're gonna be looking at the next 2 prayers. And each of those past prayers that we looked at, they are rich and they're loaded, and it is worth going back and looking at them. But today we're gonna look at the next 2 prayers that David prays. And these are prayers for guidance and deliverance. So if you walked in here today and you felt like your back was against the wall and you're needing to know how to move forward, this is for you. So we just looked at this process of how do we settle our heart? How do we breathe? How do we calm down to find ourselves centered with God? And now we're gonna talk about how do we move our feet forward? How do we know what's the right way to go? And so we're gonna pick up back in Psalms 143 in the second part of verse 8, where David prays this prayer. In the second part of verse 8, he says, show me where to walk, for I give myself to you. Rescue me from my enemies, Lord. I run to you to hide me. How many of us can so resonate with that first prayer? That prayer of God, show me where to walk, for I give myself to you. Show me, God. What am I supposed to do? Show me, God. I want to get this right. Help me. Show me where to go. How many of us know that moment to where we so deeply want to get this right? We want to follow God. We want to do the right thing. We want to walk in faithfulness. We want to wake up the next morning with no regrets. We find ourselves saying, God, I really want to do this well. Show me. I just need some clarity. Have you guys found yourselves praying that prayer? And then just kind of finding yourself being like, so God, how do I do this? How do I know if this is the right way to go? So if we go back to the Psalms, we realize that what happens is when we recenter back on God and we give God, we just say, we do our very best to realign back to Him. But it's now time to act. How do we move forward? So how do we move forward when we gotta make the choice and we gotta respond and the doctor's waiting on a decision and the lawyers give you a deadline and your kid's looking at you waiting for a response? How do we respond? How do we know where to go? How do we know where God is telling us to go? Well, first of all, I just need you guys to know that God is way bigger, that God's ways are bigger than our ways, and we can't force His hand. He's not a genie in a bottle that He grants our wishes or magic spells that we cast then get clarity on. There's really no absolute way to have 100% certainty of what you're supposed to do. But I just want to share with you guys the 3 best ways that I have ever discovered to know how to understand where God's leading you. The 3 best ways that I've ever discovered to have clarity on how do you know which way God is saying, walk this way. So how do we know where God is telling us to go? First thing is we do what He's already told us. The second thing is we listen to wise counsel. And the third thing is we listen to the echoes He's resonating in our souls. We do what He says. We listen to wise counsel. We listen to what He's stirring in our souls. And guys, this says easy, but it does hard. See, we have to start with the Bible as our baseline, because how do you know that what you're thinking or desiring or feeling is actually from God? See, Jeremiah, this Old Testament prophet, he warns us. He says the human heart is the most deceitful of all things and desperately wicked. Who really knows how bad it is? See, we have to start with the Bible because we can trick ourselves into thinking that just about anything is right. I remember once in high school, I had tricked myself into thinking that God was telling me to go to Dave Carlson and that tell Dave to give me his Jeep, his CJ7, which I don't know if you guys know what a CJ7 Jeep is, but it's like the best. It's just like a Mamba Jamba Jeep. Like the muffler itself makes high school boys' chest hairs grow. It is an awesome, awesome Jeep. And so I remember during church, I had convinced myself that I was supposed to go ask Dave for his Jeep. God was wanting me to have Dave's Jeep. And so after church, I bravely walk up to Dave and I'm like, Dave, I feel like God's telling you to give me your Jeep. And he just looked at me and he goes, well, if God tells me to do that, I'll do it. And he walked away from me. And guys, I felt so dumb because that wasn't God. That was just my greed. That was just me trying to use God to get what I wanted. But how many times have we done that same thing? Convincing ourselves that what we feel is true, that what we feel about that relationship or that use of money or that joke or that idea or that entertainment or that friend or that desire, that that's right. See, guys, we've got to listen to Jeremiah, and we got to remember that the human heart is the most deceitful of all things, and we can't fool ourselves into making horrible choices. Choices that in hindsight, we will deeply regret. That's why the first thing we gotta do is we gotta check our desires against Scripture. What has God already made clear? Man, we gotta start there. The Bible is truly our plumb line of truth. It's the truth. It's our safeguard from ourselves. It's the way that we are safeguarded from forcing our will over God's will. So we must start by doing what God has already told us to do. So that's why, as a church, we have Bible reading plans and we do Bible Discover monthly. And if you need help starting to understand the Bible or how to read it or how to connect to it, man, go to someone in the Next Steps booth, say something online. We would love to help you take those steps. So how do we move forward? How do we figure out where God's leading us? Is we start by working the process of centering our heart back on God. And then we start by checking ourselves against the Bible. And then next, we check ourselves against trusted community. We listen to wise counsel. Proverbs 11:14 says, there is safety in having many advisors. Safety in having many advisors. Man, we lean into wise men and women around us who are trusted and following Jesus, and we listen to them. We humble ourselves and say to them, hey, I may have missed something. My heart may have gotten tripped up on something. I may be convincing myself of something that's not true. I may have misunderstood what God is saying here. Help me know what is wise. Check me before I hurt me. That's why we deeply believe in getting everyone here plugged into a group. And right now we're launching millions of small groups right now across all of our different campuses. And these are all excuses just to help each and every one of us find a tribe to walk through life's best of days and worst of days, to help us make sense of what is the right and good direction to go. And how do we make sure that we're not deceiving ourselves into doing something we will later regret? How do we have safe and wise people around us to make the right choices? Man, the phone calls that break my heart the most are the ones whenever people find themselves with their back against the wall, but no tribe around them. When they haven't done the work to put the people around them before life pushes them. So no one, and one of the worst places we can be is when we have no one around us to help guide us. So give yourself a gift. And start today by surrounding yourself with people you can trust who are wise counsel. But here's the thing. It is one thing to have a wise friend. It's another thing to use a wise friend. You've got to believe that it's truly okay to go to your friends and to say, I'm not okay. And to be able to be brave enough to say to those wise friends, I need you to help me. To be humble enough to say, I need you. I once had a close friend who just made some horrible life decisions. It just was like, he just set bombs off in all of his life, destroyed a ton of stuff. And so he and I were grabbing breakfast a couple of weeks later just to talk about the damage and the fallout. And I remember over breakfast, I was trying to make sense of how did I miss all of this? And he just looked at me and he said, you didn't miss anything because I refused to show you anything. Man, if he had only said, I'm not okay, we would have thrown our arms around him. Wise counsel only works if you work with your wise counsel. Wise counsel only works if you work with your wise counsel. So be brave and say something today. So, how do we know where God is telling us to go? We do what he's already told us to do. We listen to wise counsel. And then finally, we listen to the echoes that he's resonating in our souls. Some of us can't sense where God is leading us because we are so insanely busy and distracted that our lives are simply too loud. We're glued to a screen, or our schedule is overwhelming. We wake up and run. We wake up and we start running, and then we don't stop until we crash into our beds at night. Margaret Feidenberg, one of my favorite authors, she wrote in this book called Sacred Echoes, she said, God rarely speaks in a booming voice, but if we'll slow down and silence our hearts, we'll hear the echoes in the caverns of our souls. A phrase here, a prompt there, a song lyric from the radio, a verse that pops out on our phone, a random comment from a friend, all echoes of God's invitation saying this is the way to go. Guys, God is speaking, but we've got to get quiet enough, still enough to actually hear him. So as we find ourselves with our back against the wall, may we work the 4-step process. May we find ourselves just instinctively saying, no, I'm okay, I'm gonna pause, and I'm gonna remember, and I'm gonna ponder, and I'm gonna meditate, and I'm gonna, from that place, worship and be re-centered back on God. And then from there, when it is time to make a decision, and it is time to make a choice, and you've gotta move your feet, May we move our feet doing what God's already said in the Bible and listening to wise counsel and what they're affirming, and then echoing what we've sensed God saying in our souls. And in this journey of being pushed against the wall and looking back to God and figuring out how to go forward, may we never forget the promise of 1 Corinthians 13, that God's love never fails. It never fails us when we get it right and when we don't, when we make the perfect choice and when we're begging for a redo. God's love never fails. So no matter how long you feel like you're pushed against the wall, or no matter how long you're looking for clarity, or how long you're confused trying to figure out, or how long you're having to lean into your friends and your wise counsel, or you're trying to listen for those echoes, or how embarrassing it is asking for help, no matter how long that is, don't forget that God is there. Jesus is there with you. That God's deliverance may not be getting you out of the problem, but discovering that God is with you in the problem. And so many times we want answers. But what Jesus wants is to love us. And so as you find yourself pushed against the wall and remembering and pondering and meditating and worshiping and asking, what's the Bible say? What does the friends say? And how do I listen to the echoes? Man, don't miss that God is with you. Jesus is there. No matter what, there will be Jesus. No matter what's got your back against the wall, there will be Jesus. Jesus, man, there's just moments that it just seems like life pushes us against the wall so hard. And God, I pray that in those moments that we get pushed back and the breath gets knocked out, that we will just instinctively find ourselves doing what we've been talking about in this series of just instinctively remembering who you are and how great you are and how good you are and how faithful you are, and then pondering on how grand you are, and then meditating on how you've shown up in our lives. And then from that place of remembering and pondering and meditating, just find ourselves drifting into worshiping you, centered with you. And God, when the time comes that we need to make a choice and our feet need to move, may we find ourselves doing what David did and just praying and saying, God, show me which way to go. And God, I'm just so thankful that you're not a God of confusion. And that as we look to scripture and we look to wise counsel and we listen to the echoes you put in our hearts, you faithfully show us the next step. Rarely do you show us all the steps, but you faithfully show us the next step. God, thanks for being there right in the middle of all those highs and all those lows, that there is always Jesus when we feel it and when we don't. Thank you that there's always Jesus with us. It's in your name we pray. Amen.
Every time I try to make it on my own, every time I try to stand and start to fall, all those lonely roads that I've traveled on, there was Jesus. When the life I built came crashing to the ground, when the friends I had were nowhere to be found, I couldn't see it then, but I could see it now. There was Jesus. In the waiting, in the searching, in the healing, in the hurting, like a blessing buried in the broken pieces. Every minute, every moment, where I'm in or where I'm going, even when I didn't know it, I couldn't see it, there was Jesus. From spinning needs amazing
matter what you're facing, no matter what's got your back pressed against the wall, no matter how you're needing direction, there is Jesus right there, right now with you. No matter what decision you are begging for guidance on, there is Jesus. No matter how deliverance might come, because it may look nothing like you think it will, there is always Jesus. Man, I pray that this week, that as we continue to remember and to ponder and to meditate and to worship, that is from that place of worship we find ourselves, we find answers to these prayers of praying, God, which way do I go? And that we see his deliverance and we see that he is right there with us. Man, if you're sitting here and you realize that you need some wise counsel around you, you need some friends to help you figure out how to navigate, jump in a group today. Man, there's stuff in the atrium of every location right now that you can find a group. You can jump on the website or the app to go to Group Finder to find your tribe. And if you find yourself just needing to pray with someone, anytime this week, jump on the app or the website. There's people waiting to pray with you. And if you're in one of our rooms, man, we would love for you to come down front. And if you want to pray with someone, come down front to the left-hand side. We got people in every room waiting to pray with you right now. And guys, make sure you're here next week. Because next week, we're going to talk about the last two prayers that David prays in this incredible Psalms. And it's going to be an awesome way to wrap this series. But until then, LCBC, may the Lord bless and protect you. May the Lord smile on you and be gracious to you. May the Lord show you his favor and give you his peace. Thanks for being here, guys. We love you. We'll see you next week.